Got your mic?
Yes.
Tick, tick. Tick, tick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Lipskar. I'm the president of Writers House here in New York. We sort of proudly say that as the industry has started to change and agencies have started to have new forms and the West Coast has taken a bigger role, we proudly say we're the largest independent literary agency left in the world. And we're very proud of being independent and thinking about the business very, very focused through the lens of authors and their needs. Because I've introduced myself, I'm going to take off this little sticker now, if that's okay. So it's going to fall off anyway. I guess I should say I've been working in the industry now for pretty much 3 decades. I came to Writers House in the mid-90s. I've been there ever since, so I know nothing about working at a publishing house. I know a lot about working at Writers House. And started as an agent's assistant and became an agent and then ultimately the president of the company. I share running the company with my colleague, Amy Burkhauer, who some of you may know, who's the CEO, and that's how we divide our silly titles, but we run the company together. So,
Do you want to mention some of the clients?
It's funny.
Completely.
I never mention clients when I do bios, but if you insist, we can. I mean, Writers House as a whole represents many of the world's biggest brands. I represent Sarah J. Maas. My colleague Amy represents Dave Pilkey. So right there, you have the 2 biggest brands in 2 markets in the world right now. We represent Nora Roberts. I represent Christopher Paolini. My colleague Jody Reamer represents Alex Astor and Stephanie Meyer.
Okay, that's enough.
Yeah, okay.
That's all sad. Enough. We get the point. No, I'm kidding.
That's what we do. No.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Oh no, Lisa Damone would kill me if I didn't say James Clear, so I got to
Yes.
throw that one in too. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, there you go. I also think it's worth mentioning that you have a kind of separate career or a big interest in something very different from publishing. I'd
Yeah.
like people to talk about that, just to say it, because, we should all have lives.
Right. People who know me know that I have a secret life as a musician. I conduct youth orchestras. In fact, last night, that's what I was doing, not preparing for this. We have a concert. I conduct the New Jersey Youth Symphony. We have a concert next weekend. So we were having our second to last rehearsal. I grew up, my 2 loves were books and music, and thought that life was going to force me to make a choice. And it turns out if you're literally insane and you want to work 2 full-time jobs, you don't have to make a choice. But you're literally insane. But
Let's all take that as a lesson. Are we not insane? Okay, so we're here to talk about the rights business. And a lot of times in this industry, people think the rights business is what gets done in a sub-rights department in a publishing company. And one of the things we've thought about a lot on the rights committee is that rights, again, going back to the whole, it's a big, long supply chain. Rights are involved in many pieces along the way. And what we do when we're licensing, as an agent, perhaps licensing in primary content to a first publication, right, to a publisher, from an author to a publisher for the first time, is a rights deal. And whether or not those rights are granted to a publisher, some might remain with an agency. There's someone in the agency who's doing pretty much the same kind of process that's happening in a trade publishing rights department. So we're all doing a lot of the same things. And just to harp a little bit, we're all suffering the same kind of problems. So it's been a big deal for us on the committee to continue to include agents in our conversation. And as Brian mentioned, we have several members of the AALA who are with us and working with us on our projects. So the rights business, like the publishing business, has changed a lot over time, even a lot in a very short recent history. So it's been, for perspective, maybe you all just know this in your heads, but I had to write it down. It's 30 years since Amazon went public, 17 years since the Kindle came out. And I know you have a way of talking about what that has meant for the publishing business. Why don't you take us through your metaphor And tell us a little bit about what's different today.
Sure. So I entered the business at exactly this sort of moment of transition, right? So I started working at Writers House in 1996. And you can think of Writers House, you can think of publishing in 1996. Everyone complained and said it was the worst it would ever been, and all these problems. We know that routine, right? We're all professionals in this business. But we look back on that and you're like, Eden, right? You remember there was this unspoiled business. It worked on its own terms. And what happened, in my view, is that we had this gorgeous Edenic globe, and an enormous asteroid came from outer space, went through the atmosphere and landed, but it didn't land in the middle of the land. It landed in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But it's a really, really big asteroid. And what happened is that from the moments of its landing, as you know, from when you throw rocks into ponds, you get waves, you get ripples. But these are not little ripples because this was an asteroid the size of a small planet, right? And of course, that asteroid was the rise of the internet and all of the effects it was going to have. And I basically see the landscape of publishing of having been swept by a series of, tsunamis that have come from that landing in the middle of the ocean, but they're all from the same rock, really, right? Every one of them, it comes from the same rock. And one of the things that I find interesting about the way we think in publishing is at various points, I've heard publishing kind of do the exhale of like, well, we survived that one, right? You remember back to the days when the ebook arose and everyone was like, here comes the end, right? And of course, it was a massive, massive changes, a tsunami-like change to the landscape. But what didn't happen was a kind of collapse of value in written words in book form. We didn't see a subscription business yet. Publishers. We didn't get me on that topic and I'll be grumpy. But we didn't see a subscription business the way we were already seeing in other media that were completely destructive. Like music didn't have a choice. Their choice was either free or subscription. So they went with subscription, but we know what that did to the value of listening to music. We didn't have that happen. And we were all like, we survived. And then for various reasons, you probably remember the point, I know I'm going on about this. Remember the point when ebook sales seemed to peak at publishers, at trade publishers, and start to decline a little bit. And we're all like, see, it's even better, right? Of course, we forgot that was because Amazon changed its terms, but never mind. The point is that we keep thinking we've survived, and then we keep being shocked that there's another wave. And of course, the new one that I think you're referring to is AI. That's the new wave coming in. But it comes from the same place, and it's going to be just as disruptive. Maybe this one's even more disruptive. The first tsunami is not necessarily the biggest one in this particular metaphor. So, yeah.
So do you think back about the way you went about licensing rights to publishers in the beginning compared to what you're focusing on now?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, Writers House as an agency has always had a deep commitment to its own rights business. I mean, probably in the United States, at least. I mean, anyone who knows the British business knows that the British agencies have been very, very dedicated to rights as a business since the beginning of their business. In America, it was always like, you kind of grow into it, right? You hope to, if you get big enough, you'll hire a rights manager who'll build some co-agency relationships. Writers House was always very focused on rights. The founder of the company, Al Zuckerman, when he was trying to build it up, I mean, this is all sort of tell the ancient history to say how we've changed, right? One of the ways he built the business was he took on representing the rights for lots of small publishers. So that, and in the early days, that was just a way to create cash flow, right? He just needed to support the business. He also we had a scouting department back then, so some of you may know Kassia Vashevsky, who turned into one of the top film TV people in the world. She started as she started at Random House, but she started as a scout at Writers House. What happened for us, and this is actually an interesting transition, is probably about 15 to 20 years ago. So after the tsunami, we could start to see some of the changes occurring in the business. And Writers House changed its perspective about how it thought about rights pretty dramatically. And the key for us, and this isn't to say that revenue wasn't important, but the key for us was to transition from thinking of it as a way to create cash flow as in turning it into a focus on service to the client, right? So at that point, we actually let all of our small publisher clients go. Some of whom were friends and we adored, but nonetheless, we said, this isn't what we do anymore, right? We're not trying to generate a lot of business through rights. What we're trying to do is provide really extraordinary service to the clients who we represent. And that change has really informed all the way we think about the business since. And these days, if Cecilia de la Campa, who runs our department, is, many of you probably know, she's extraordinary. And she asked us about 5 or 6 years ago to change the name of our department. It's no longer the subsidiary rights department. It's the what does she call it? Global licensing and something, but I don't remember exactly. But it's in other words, the idea of it being a subsidiary right was removed from our thinking, and instead it became a fundamental aspect of how we think about copyright and maximizing value for our clients.
Yeah. Yeah, we all have that chip about subsidiary, right?
Yeah.
We all want to.
Well, maybe she got it from you, but we said yes. So
some people have said that. I think maybe you should talk about how you first learned about why publishers buy books.
Yeah. So this is like, so you've heard that I'm a musician, right? And I was a reader. So I did not have an MBA. I did not take math classes in college. I thought that I was going to be, when I first started working, I was going to be the agent who was really, really good at editorial kind of, but I always thought business, that's kind of a strange thing. I don't know if I'm going to be good at that, right? And I felt very bad at that at the beginning, like many of us do, because we come into it because we love books, and then suddenly we're business people, right? I had a couple of conversations early in my career when I went to lunch that changed my life as a literary agent, right? And they were when I went to lunch with an editor at an imprint. I'm going to do this as fast as possible so I don't lose too much time. But who said to me, it was Spring, who said, by the way, if you have a book you can sell me today or tomorrow, like right now, that we can ship 50,000 copies in the fall, we will overpay you for that. Now, I was a young agent at the time. So first of all, I was like, if I had a book you could ship 50,000 copies of, you think it'd be sitting in my, dusty drawer? No, I would have sold it to you already. But also it's like, what the hell does that mean? Like, you'll overpay me for a book that you can ship 50,000 copies of in the fall? What is that? My whole thought was that, is that books created their own value, right? But suddenly someone was saying to me something very different, which was the value wasn't about the book. It was about its role within the publishing model. So, very strangely, I went to lunch. I didn't have all that insight right away. I went to lunch the next week with another editor at a different imprint of the same corporation who said the same thing to me. And that was the moment I was like, okay, I have to figure out what's going on here. This is bizarre. And so I spent the next few years going to lunches and having drinks and talking to people and going to conferences and just asking a lot of questions. And I became really, really intrigued about the structures and the ways that publishing works on a financial basis and how that informs the decisions that we're all making, sometimes consciously, but actually mostly unconsciously, I think, that really have tremendous impact. By the way, the answer to the question of why they were asking was, at the time, no longer. Their imprints were being judged on a budgetary basis by gross revenue, which meant that everyone's bonuses were going to be contingent upon bringing in the right amount of revenue. It didn't have to do with profit. It didn't have to do with net sales. It had to do with gross revenue. And which, if you think about it, kind of makes a little bit of sense and is also completely insane, but it does, but you understand why that would matter, right? You have to cover overhead. And so you want the money in the calendar year, and we'll worry about next year, and then we'll do the same thing again, right? But that was, that blew my mind when I realized that. Like, that's incredible. That's why they're doing that.
I wanted that story because, we talk a lot in terms of licensing rights to people and talking to people about books. We talk a lot about how to understand what our customers are looking for. And often that takes a very basic path, which is, you're interested in this topic, you're the editor of these kind of books, so you'll want these other kind of books. But there's a lot going on behind it in almost every publishing company, good decisions or not, depending on how you want to look at the industry, to measure everything on gross revenue when we know we're all subject to, say, returns, and et cetera. But it's about thinking about negotiation. This is something I would like to talk a lot more about in the rights group, but we get all caught up in all our technical issues too. Negotiating and being able to listen and understand really the context of why people buy books, and the spoken requests that we hear from people, and maybe the subconscious, unconscious reasons that they might be looking for titles and wanting to publish books. So it's just something to think about as we're looking at how we do what we do.
Well, negotiation, obviously agents love talking about negotiation. And I spend a lot of time thinking about it, not just how to maximize each outcome, but actually just thinking about what is happening in a negotiation. And I'm not providing any insight. This is a commonplace, right, to know, and this is really important to anyone who's selling anything at any time. You have to know what your customer is thinking and wanting, right? You can't have a successful negotiation across the table if all you're thinking about is your own needs and desires and wants and outcomes, right? The best outcomes are going to come from understanding what they want. The twist that I would sort of add to it is so, because our business tends to think, I love that BISG spends so much time thinking about data and processes and numbers and all this kind of stuff, because the business as a whole tends to not think about those things, I would say, in when you're in negotiations. And what I would say is that it's not just a really great negotiation is not just knowing what the person you're negotiating with consciously wants to achieve so that you can help them get there and also get what you want. But you also have to take into consideration the unconscious things, the structures that they're not aware of that are undergirding it. So, for example, I think this is where you wanted me to take this. I feel really strongly that we as an industry have a profound misunderstanding of our business model. That we talk about, and this is everyone, just I'm not saying publishers, agents, publishers, everyone. We think that we know that it's a business based on risk, but we misunderstand what the risk we're taking is, right? So I'll give you the obvious example, right? We know that if you were talking to a portfolio manager at Goldman Sachs, right, they're making bets on a regular basis, and they have a portfolio. They've modeled out what they're doing. They know why they're doing it, and they know that certain bets they're taking are more, quote, risky than other bets, right? But they're not thinking of that bet as creating inherent risk for their portfolio, because the need to take that risk is built into their business model, right? If they don't take that risk, they're actually not doing their jobs. So when one of those risks goes south and doesn't work out, you don't hear them going, well, oh, God, we really took maybe they say we might have a drink and say I took a beating on that one, but it doesn't feel existential, because it's not about, because they're seeing the portfolio as a whole. Constantly, I think because the guy at Morgan Stanley, or the woman at Morgan Stanley, doesn't care really about that trade in any way other than the money that they're going to make. Whereas we care quite a bit about our individual books, and that care blinds us to the fact that risk is not inherent for the publisher or on an individual book, right? There's no risk that they're taking that's real risk for the portfolio as a whole. And I think that's really important for anyone who's engaged in negotiation to recognize that that's kind of the case across most of our business. Not all of them. There are different circumstances. Some small markets, some small entities have different models. I'm talking obviously about large commercial entities with large portfolios. Risk means something very different, and understanding that can really have a tremendous amount of impact on how you think about the business. And mostly I just like to talk about this to socialize the idea that when I go to lunch and someone says, oh, we took a real bath on that book, and they're caterwauling and they're saying this, so I'm like, you're getting this wrong, right? If your boss is judging you for that, then you've done this, then they're telling you the wrong thing, right? Because if you become risk averse, you're not going to do your job anymore. Right? You're gonna start chasing that which everyone else is chasing. You're losing the opportunity that having a big portfolio gives you, which is to create a diverse portfolio of assets. Right. So fundamentally, I think it's so important that we start to think about that differently. And in a negotiation, being aware of what the risk is and what it isn't is a very powerful thing, because it can change how you negotiate and how you're talking to the person across the table who may be expressing tremendous amounts of tension and grief and anxiety about the risk that they believe they're taking, and helping them sometimes to see that they're not as much as they think they are can help get a negotiation where you need it to be. Now, of course, you can't be snide about it. I'm just saying, but to be genuinely empathetic and understand why they feel that way, and also to try to talk through how maybe that risk isn't exactly what they're expressing, is useful for an individual negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, it feeds into something we talk about, which is that publishers tend not to see their business the way in my mind, and I think in yours it makes sense, which is a publishing business is a portfolio of rights. And I'll extend the metaphor a little further and tell you that, because I know there's some people here, we're all at different stages in our career, it's worth thinking about your career as a portfolio, a set of investments you're making and risks you're taking. And of course, when you're making your first bet, it feels like a lot. But after you've made 7 or 107 or 10,007, you're then beginning to see the profile of what that is. And I mean, this is publishing. This is not, I like to say it's not pediatric emergency medicine, right? I mean, there's risk and there's risk.
But it's worth saying that one of the other elements of doing risk analysis, which I try to do, is essentially what I'm saying we should do, is to recognize that different entities have different risk attached to them. So when you talk to an agent, one of the things that you're also should always be aware, and when you're when you have a suite of rights that you're handling on behalf, which your publisher has acquired, if you're working a rights department, a publisher, to remember that for the author, risk is actually very high and existential, right? They can go from selling a book to never writing a book again. Right? That's how extraordinary the risk is. That is completely different than the risk associated with acquiring a book by a publisher. And so remembering that everyone's risk is different is really, really important. When I was saying that about risk before, I want to underline that if you start talking to a startup publisher in Romania, right, they're taking an enormous amount of risk with every acquisition they're taking. Their risk is existential. Like, you can't pretend that they're in the same situation as selling a book to Goldman, where you're part of a huge entity, not only a huge imprint in a German company, but a part of a huge German publishing company, which is part of a huge international publishing company, which is part of a huge international corporation, right? Yeah. So the different elements of risk attached. And for authors, I mean, one of the things that, look, we all know that there's a lot of tension that surrounds the question of publishers acquiring rights from authors. No one's going to pretend otherwise. We all know it's true, right? One of the critical reasons I think there's so much tension is that at the moment of the transaction, the author's extraordinary risk is no longer the focus of attention, right? And I mean that genuinely. That since your job, if you work in a rights department, is to, obviously sell those rights. You want your editors to acquire those rights if possible. The best way I think to sort of mitigate some of the feeling that surrounds it is to remember how existential that risk is for the author and to think about it in that way. Now, for agents, it's easy because we have a literal legal fiduciary responsibility to the client. I would love, when publishers acquire rights, for them to consider that they have taken over that fiduciary responsibility to the writer, which means they now have competing interests. Now, I'm not making a legal argument. Please don't call your GCs and have an argument with them about it, because they'll tell you it's not a fiduciary, and I'm not trying to make a legal case right now. But I am saying, conceptually, remembering that can make a big difference. And in terms of when you do acquire them, how you go about thinking about it, how you go about communicating. I mean, when we're talking about this, one of the things you mentioned we should discuss is the range of things that rights departments can do in their relationship with authors. And I would say some of it's really kind of the admin, right? Like which we spend so much time on, actually catching reversions when they come, doing the relicenses, taking back rights if they've lied fallow, even if the term hasn't ended yet, doing renegotiations, not taking first offers from, questioning the needs. So this one is going to get me in trouble. Questioning the needs of your corporation that wants you to sell to the sister company at a discount, But those are things like you want to know what makes an author unhappy, knowing that the publisher, for their own reasons, has underpriced their book in a sale to a related company.
You just mentioned all those important markers in the life of a book, and I just want to bring you back for 2 minutes to data. Obviously, you're tracking a lot of that within your agency in terms of the deals that you make, and obviously, rights departments also have systems. You have a system at Writers House for.
We have we don't, like many people and the agencies these days are using literary expert. We call it LitX. In the UK, everyone uses Brad, but here everyone seems to be using LitX these days. And we use it pretty comprehensively, but it's a really interesting question. We have spent so much time talking about how deep we want our data work to go.
Yeah.
And we almost always fall down the side of less than we think we would ideally want, because as you can probably guess from this conversation, I am a total data nerd, and I will spend all day geeking out over numbers and information that I can put on a spreadsheet and play with. But the reality is that for the author, we're not convinced that in most of the time that being comprehensive is actually creating more value for the author. We spend more time worrying about their needs on an individual granular basis because we're not a corporation and we are very individual client based. And so we do a lot. We're not, I would never say that we are certain that we have the best data in the industry.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time within departments having systems to do things like make sure that we're very, very conscious in Cecilia's department, very conscious of terms, very conscious of, not only the monetary terms, but the changes in terms. We have very, very detailed, systems for tracking boilerplate term changes across markets,
Right.
Best terms we get across markets. And by the way, to go back to things that we were talking about that we would love publishers to do as well is to really focus on getting best terms in the contracts when you sell rights, and not just being like, yeah, we do this every time with this people, we'll just take the same terms. But we're a huge pain in the ass on every negotiation, and it's what you should be, a huge pain in the ass at every negotiation.
There's your advice from Simon Lipskar, everyone. I think we're literally out of time, Simon. I could talk to you all day. Where can people find you?
You can find me, obviously, Writers House. We're very easy, writershouse.com, and we're all first initial last name. So if you wanted to reach out, it's just slipskar, writershouse.com. And though we're always submerged, I'm also very happy to meet or talk after this. I wish I could stay today, but I have a bunch of things that have I was saying before, I'm looking up the mountain and there's an avalanche coming down towards me. So I have to go run and escape the avalanche. So it was a pleasure speaking to all of you today.
Thank you very much.